Welcome to Belmont Journal. This is a special edition, and we're focusing on possible uses of the former incinerator site here in the town of Belmont. And today we're going to be talking about solar energy and energy storage. And to talk about solar energy, we have a special guest, Pat Fennessey, who's the Director of Asset Management at Kearsarge Energy.
Great to be here, thanks.
Thanks for coming. I understand that Kearsarge works with the town of Concord on a solar farm, or there's a solar farm that you've installed in Concord. Is that correct?
That's correct. So one site in 2014 and then another in 2016.
Okay. In general, for the audience out there, how does a solar farm work anyway?
Well, we basically, to build solar, you need a reasonably flat surface. We can build on curved surfaces. So typically, if we're building for a landfill, we'd probably be, for the most part, right on top of the landfill.
Okay.
So once you've kind of designed the site and decided how big it has to be and formed the financial partnerships to actually put the financing together for the site, you'd then contract for the construction.
Okay.
The construction typically consists of putting down what's called racking. Mm-hmm. Racking actually supports those solar panels.
Okay.
You would then place the panels, and then they would wire the panels together to other pieces of equipment like inverters, transformers, and some of that. When that's all done, you connect it all up to the public utility typically. Okay. So that the energy can get pumped out to the energy grid.
Basically delivering electricity back to the utility, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And just for my own curiosity, you can have really large solar farms, you can have really small, and is there a certain size you need to make it efficient?
It really depends on what the use is. I mean, as I'm sure you're aware, you can do rooftop solar on your home, and it's terrific for a single consumer. We do mostly commercial grade and utility grade, so typically our sites are over 1 megawatt.
How does solar energy perform compared to other forms of energy?
Solar is really a wonderful neighbor to have. It's very non-disruptive. It's not as efficient as something like coal or gas, but again, it's completely renewable. And most people are willing to trade off that slight loss of efficiency in order to get something that's completely renewable and not disruptive.
And that's seemingly, well, it is more important as time goes by to have more sustainable or renewable sources of energy, is that right?
Absolutely.
What's the production of electricity throughout the year? Does it go up and down? Solar?
Yes, it does. I think we have a chart on that. Typically, solar production is very low when the days are short. So in the winter, starting in November, December, January, our production is really at its lowest ebb. The second thing that tends to depress production in the winter is the presence of snow.
Okay.
So snow is wonderful in the sense that it scours the panel and really cleans them very well, but we can't produce energy when there's snow on the panels. So the energy production over the year rises very rapidly beginning in March, and really peaks in June, July, and August. And all of this, of course, is weather dependent. If you have a run of thunderstorms, for example, in the middle of the summer, that can make a big difference in how much production you get.
So if there was a lot of snow one winter, would the entity, the municipality or the power company be out to sort of clean? Can you clean the snow off of the solar collectors? Is that really not?
We've had very mixed results with that. We have attempted it when we know we're going to have a great run of weather right after the snow event. For the most part, the snow melts off the panels pretty rapidly, depending on how much they're tilted and what kind of snow it is. Ice tends to be a little bit more difficult.
So it's not that.
It lasts sometimes a day or two, but typically it's off pretty rapidly.
And what are the revenues that can be expected from a solar farm, and how does like say, the town of Concord benefit?
The finances can be a little bit complicated.
Okay.
We work with an organization in Rhode Island that's a consortium between a university and a town.
Okay.
And the savings can be as high as almost $1 million a year.
Wow.
Again, that's highly dependent on how big the site is and what kind of arrangements for financing the site have been negotiated, but they can be quite significant for a town.
Okay. And actually, Kearsarge has a number of these sorts of projects, is that right?
Yes, we've got upwards of 35 and another 15 in development right now.
Would that be just in Massachusetts or beyond?
We have sites, we actually have a couple of sites in Hawaii, but for the most part we're focused on the Northeast. So we have
Okay.
some sites in New York, some sites in Rhode Island, and then many sites in Massachusetts.
Would you say that this is, it may be a dumb question, but do you see more and more and more of this sort of thing happening with towns or with the government agencies, that sort of thing? Partnerships?
Yeah, very, very much so.
Okay.
What excites us the most is the ability to take an underutilized resource like a landfill, for example, and be able to say to a town, not only will you get energy savings from the net metering credits that the site will generate, but you'll also get lease revenue. There's a possibility of getting tax revenue. So you can take a piece of property that's basically producing nothing and turn it into an asset for a municipality, which is hugely exciting.
And I'm just curious, it's sort of a little bit off the script here, but how is it to make that argument to say, to use an underutilized piece of land for renewable energy, there's a long-term benefit, compared to a town that might be considering, well, if we sell that property to a developer or something, you know, the profit. So how do you make that argument? How easy it is to make that argument?
I think it's really a case by case, and
Okay.
in some situations, I'm not sure it's always possible to sell the property
Okay,
to
I
a
see.
developer because some of these landfills really must kind of stay the way they are.
I see. So that really may not be as big a factor as
Exactly.
people might think.
Right.
Okay.
And one of the sites that we've done for Concord is actually a Superfund site. So the options for doing things with that land are really very severely limited.
I know there's some situations where a town has to say how much, you know, what's the short-term benefit, what's the long-term benefit, and they have to make those decisions both from a policy perspective, but from a political perspective too, is
Of course.
how that gets portrayed. But what do you do, what can you do to manage or to prevent any compromise of the capping of the landfill site?
I think we may have a slide that shows kind
Okay.
of a cross section. The way landfill caps typically work, there are several layers. The top layer is usually 18 to 2 feet of soil, and underneath that is a membrane. So
Okay.
when we build these sites, we build them in a very specific way, rather than putting posts down for those solar panels, for that racking that we talked about before, that would be drilled into the ground. What we use are big concrete ballasts
Oh, okay.
that actually support both the fencing around the site and the solar panels themselves.
So the combined weight sort of also
Exactly.
keeps it in place.
And then we have kind of a rigorous inspection process for that. When you're dealing with landfills, we want to make sure there's not uneven settlement. You want to make sure that the landfill itself is not disrupted. So you have to be very careful when we're working with landfills.
In Concord, the solar farm is not necessarily next to or close to a residential neighborhood, is that right?
That's correct.
It's going to be closer to a residential neighborhood if it was built in Belmont. Any issues around that people should be concerned about or just be aware of? Let's put it that way.
I think solar is a great neighbor. I think, as I said to you earlier, it's like having a cemetery in your backyard without the mourners
I see.
or the
Okay.
ghosts.
Right.
It's they're very quiet. They make no noise. They remain habitat for animals, and that's something we're very concerned about. Most of the time we have a 6-inch gap at the bottom of the fence so that animals that are there before can continue to use the
Okay.
land. And so I think it's one of the more benign uses of land in terms of how it affects the local community.
Okay, well that's good to hear. And the proposed site in Belmont, again, is also close to conservation land. Any issues around that, any adverse effect or?
We work really closely with the conservation commissions typically, and they may have special requirements. So for example, sometimes we'll be asked to use a particular seed mix because the Conservation Commission wants the area planted with a particular type of plant.
Okay.
We are always watching for the development of invasive species and that sort of thing because that has to be controlled early on so that they don't get out of control. And then we, again, keep those communications lines open with the Conservation Commission to make sure we understand what they're seeing and what we need to do to keep the site in good shape.
And in this case, are you aware of, and I realize we're very early in looking at this process, but do you have to submit plans or plans to the Conservation Commission, to the state?
Yes.
That all has to be approved by the state anyway?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right.
And it has, typically we get special conditions from conservation committees and commissions. They'll tell us exactly what they want us to do.
Okay.
The kind of great thing about solar to me is if there are great leaps in, say, handling a landfill, well, you're not committed forever to the solar facility.
Okay. Right.
And we'll give you back the land in great condition. So it's not an option that really closes off other options down the line.
You can actually
Yeah,
take it
most
out,
of the
right.
time the towns require us to provide a decommissioning plan
Okay.
so that everyone understands how we'll actually deal with removing the site.
That makes sense.
And it's not difficult. It's racking, it's panels.
Right.
It's pretty
So,
simple.
And I know that a lot of the innovation and research also in the energy storage sector, of development of batteries, and that's really the other end of that,
Right.
which we're going to be talking about later. One other question that people probably have is glare from solar panels when you're driving past it. Any issues there?
We don't think so. The FAA issued an extensive report since there are many solar farms near airports. And their glare could be a major concern because you certainly wouldn't want landing aircraft to be in a situation where there was lots of glare. So the FAA has said that solar is a little bit less reflective than water and less reflective than vegetation. So for the most part, there's not a concern. Solar panels are designed to absorb light, not to reflect it.
Okay.
So typically not a huge issue.
Great. Well, I've learned a lot about solar farms, and I hope you all and our audience have as well. It's a very helpful conversation for the residents of Belmont to know what choices they have in the former incinerator site. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Now we're going to take a look at a video that helps explain energy storage. Stay tuned.
Utilities like Sterling Municipal Light Department purchase electric services, like capacity and transmission, from ISO New England and their regional network service provider. Prices can fluctuate greatly depending on supply and demand in the regional market. When electricity demand is at its peak, prices for electricity and electric services are highest. By installing a battery system, a municipal utility like Sterling can start to control how and when it buys electric services from the ISO. This is important because reducing purchases during times of regional peak demand will save money for the utility and its ratepayers. Sterling uses its battery system to store low-cost electricity by charging the batteries with local solar power during the day, or by purchasing cheap power from the grid during low demand times, such as during the night. Then, at times of regional peak demand, Sterling releases or discharges stored electricity from the batteries, so it doesn't have to buy as much electricity when grid power is most expensive. This reduces the cost of electricity for the ratepayers, and it also reduces Sterling's transmission and capacity payments to the grid operator. These payments are calculated based on the amount of power that Sterling purchases during peak pricing periods, for each month and each year. Reducing purchases of electricity during peak pricing saves hundreds of thousands of dollars per year for Sterling's ratepayers. The Sterling Battery Storage System is designed to power the town's police station and dispatch center for about 2 weeks in the event of a grid outage or disaster. With the local solar array, the batteries can power the town's police station even longer by recharging the batteries with solar, meaning Sterling's first responders will be able to help people in need if a natural disaster knocks out the grid. Sterling is the first town to install a grid-scale battery system in Massachusetts, but it won't be the last. Already other municipalities are planning similar projects. Energy storage is economical, fast to install, and it works.
I'm here now with Chris Roy, the General Manager of Belmont Light. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. I guess we're here today to discuss what could happen on the former incinerator site relative to Belmont Light. You want to tell me a little bit about what the idea here is relative to the solar farm?
Sure. So we've talked about a number of options, and so from a Belmont Light perspective, we've been focusing on the solar plus storage route that really combines the renewable energy you can get from solar with the storage capabilities of a container-sized battery platform.
Okay. And certainly there's a lot more interest these days in finding renewable energy sources, is that correct?
Absolutely. That's one of our big initiatives, starting with the Climate Action Plan that was implemented by a town meeting several years ago. We've been gradually transitioning Belmont Light's power supply to more renewable sources.
Oh, okay.
And obviously a solar array would play a big part in that.
So in terms of the current state of the former incinerator site and this project, right now it is unlikely, but it's possible still, right?
Sure.
That a solar farm could be put there.
Absolutely. So generally speaking, solar is certainly a viable option.
And you've done the studies there, you figured out, okay.
Exactly.
So,
the studies are done, the models have been completed, so we certainly know it's viable.
and what you were telling me before was that in a way it doesn't really matter what happens there. A solar farm you could still use that site to do solar, is that correct?
Exactly, and that's the great thing about solar too, is it's adaptable.
Okay.
So you could put another building there, a different use, and you could put, as you see around town, you can put solar on a roof or on the ground in some open space. So it doesn't have to be an all
Okay.
in one or the other bucket. You could have two different uses when one of the uses is solar.
And what can we say about what you would be doing there if you put a solar farm there? Talk a little bit about the solar and the storage use.
Sure. So those two technologies complement each other. So as folks generally are aware, solar generates the renewable energy during the daytime.
Okay.
But when night comes, then we're looking for a mechanism to continue that renewable energy into the evening hours. So that's where storage comes into play.
Okay.
Where you can start to use that energy at different times of the day, and along with that comes other more complicated mechanisms for energy, being we can shift use to help reduce our costs during peak load times when electricity is the most expensive, and so the battery through storage allows us to harness the renewable energy and then use it when it's best for us and most favorable for us.
How would the typical Belmont resident benefit from that? Would they see a decrease in their energy costs or an efficiency or?
Those two, since it's an energy project, it's all primarily electricity bills would see the benefits.
Okay.
And so generally speaking, in rare cases you get bill reductions,
Right,
but
right.
primarily speaking it offsets other increases.
I see.
And
Okay.
so as energy and transmission prices rise as we use our resources more efficiently, we can offset those increases with our benefits.
So the delivery system, there are certain fixed costs related to that, but over time you're saying that really is going to keep price increases down and costs down.
Exactly.
Because you're able to save that energy and it's renewable.
And it's renewable,
Right.
and a big part is being able to also incorporate more renewables in the portfolio.
We don't want to get too complicated because there's still a lot of discussion to be had
Sure.
and decision to be made. But if Belmont was able to do a public-private partnership there, we know it would require an amendment in the Massachusetts legislature.
Correct.
But what would that look like in terms of how much energy would be delivered from that site?
So that's a great question. We would expect, if it was a full solar deployment, that's roughly about a 2 megawatt array.
Okay.
And with a 2 megawatt array, generally speaking, maybe 1 to 2%
Okay.
of our overall needs could
Okay.
be met with that solar facility.
And with the development of technology, do you foresee that that one site is able to generate more electricity over time, with the advancements in solar or batteries and that sort of thing?
It's actually somewhat the opposite.
Oh, okay.
Whereas the panels age, they become
Right.
less productive.
I see.
But as you replace the panels, every time a new panel comes out,
Right.
it's more efficient. It harvests more of the sun's
Right.
energy.
I think that's what I was getting at. As you
yes.
see the technology change,
So you can.
we keep seeing that batteries get better and better over time as well.
True, but typical installations we find are 20 to 30 years.
Okay, all right.
So unless there's a major malfunction, the hope is to install it and
Okay.
let it
Let
run its
it-
useful
okay.
life.
The other option that you've discussed is if there wasn't a public-private partnership, it would be an investment by the town to
Yes.
put in a solar farm. And that's, of course, another discussion to be had, but
Exactly.
that is a possibility.
So that is certainly a possibility. Obviously the challenge there is if we have to build it ourselves, then we have to come up with the capital
Right.
to buy the whole thing outright.
Right.
And then it's also our responsibility to operate, maintain, and then decommission
Okay.
later, after the 20, 30 years is complete.
But we see this kind of public-private partnership with solar energy all over Massachusetts, right? There are a lot of projects, a
That's,
lot of communities that have done that.
I would have to say primarily, with maybe a few exceptions, that's primarily the mechanism because of the contractual arrangements that you can get with these energy contracts. It maintains the ability for municipalities to use their capital reserves
Right.
for things that don't have those types
Right.
of arrangements, like truck purchases or building upgrades and things like that.
How do you combine these different sources of electricity? I mean, are there other sources that we're using here in Belmont?
Sure. So basically, given the footprint of Belmont and the limited open space that we have to rely on the combination of an in-town array, should that be the end result here, coupled with the larger percentage of resources we procure from out of town. So in that portfolio from out of town is hydroelectric, wind, some solar, and then a general bucket we refer to as grid power, which is primarily gas.
Okay.
And so what we're trying to do is transition, like the grid power, those sources away from the fossil fuels
Okay.
and move them towards these concrete renewable contracts.
Okay. So how does that fit into that's the general plan for the future for Belmont Light, and this is part of that plan. in other words.
Exactly, that's part of the plan, and currently we're looking at trying to get large chunks of our portfolio more and more renewable each year. We have a power supply policy that dictates what percentage of our portfolio should be renewable, so we have metrics and targets that we need to hit each
Okay.
year. We're currently in the process of developing a strategic plan, which I think will further make those targets more aggressive.
Ah, okay. And so people might be thinking that there's some aspect of what the Belmont Light does in terms of climate action goals and that sort of thing. Is that sort of what you're talking about.
Exactly. So to take that picture out, zoom out a little bit further,
Okay.
the climate action plan, climate action goals are more than just electricity in the electrical
Right.
sector. Really, the only energy mechanism to be 100% non-emitting from carbon emissions is electricity, because you have solar options, you have
Okay.
wind options. And so really what we're trying to do is transition Belmont Light to be the foundation for energy, and then folks can then adopt electric equivalents of transportation. You see EVs,
Oh, okay.
heating,
Right.
and appliances. And so as we adopt those electrical technologies with Belmont Light as the foundation, that's how we'll
I
meet our
see.
broader climate goals. Because
Okay.
the electric, portion of climate emissions, is a smaller percentage than, say, transportation and heating. But we have to create that foundation for folks to have an energy source that's non-emitting. And then we get everyone converted over to that energy.
So is there, and I realize you might not have the answer to the question, but a plan to have Belmont Light oversee or build charging stations for electric cars?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So we have a few stations in Claflin. We have one in our office.
Oh, okay. All right.
There's one at the water department. And then we encourage, like Cushing Square,
Yep.
we encourage new developments to incorporate EVs, but certainly moving forward, we have several locations on our radar that we think would be good for charging stations.
Now, is that something that could be, I mean, I'm just asking without any knowledge about this.
Sure.
Is that something that is also a public-private partnership possibility? Like, can you work with a third-party vendor to build a charging station? Or is that really not, that doesn't work that way?
That doesn't, because the costs and management are minimal.
Okay,
I
all
shouldn't
right,
say minimal.
okay.
I mean, a charging station installation is typically around 10,000.
Okay.
But, so we're not talking millions.
All
like
right,
a
so it's just a
solar.
matter of putting one in, and
Putting one in,
the
funding
electricity
the
is
spot.
coming from Belmont Light.
Exactly.
Okay. So we're seeing more of that development, or at least you're thinking more about that and trying to get other private businesses to think about that as well.
Exactly. In that way we can, the more accessible the infrastructure is, the more likely folks will convert to electric transportation.
Great. Anything else you want to add in terms of what you're thinking about at Belmont Light, overall plan?
I just think it's important to stay tuned, to support a lot of this electrification. Not only is it power supply that we're looking to, move forward, but it's also our rebate offerings. So we realize a lot of this is helping the community manage their energy and also be able to access the technologies that are going to help us accomplish our goals. And so our ability is to act as an advisor for those resources, provide the rebates and incentives to help folks adopt these technologies, and then have our general power supply strategy serve as the base layer.
Okay, great. Well, we'll stay tuned, and we hope you'll come back when we get a little bit further down the road on what happens to the former incinerator site and bring some benefit to Belmont residents.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today on this special edition of Belmont Journal, and we'll see you again next time.